Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and thank you to the DARIAH organisers for inviting me, and thank you to all of you being here in person and in the virtual world. When I first got the invitation, I thought, have you read The Third Man? Do you remember the beginning of The Third Man? The British Council invite this writer, and he is so pleased to go there. And really, they've invited somebody else. They invited a literary writer, and he turns up, and he's a writer of cowboy fiction. And I was a little bit worried it would be this situation, but they've assured me it's okay. So I'm a writer of Gothic fiction, of crime fiction, of short stories, of opera libretti, and I paint my scenes in very bold colours, even when those colours are black and grey. And I'm going to talk about the creation of the kind of fiction that I write, the kind of genre fiction that I write, and what I believe to be its connection to the past and to memories, our own and collective. I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes, no longer than that, and I've got a watch, so I won't go over, I promise. If I do, throw something at me. So what follows is a kind of collage. And this has been a really busy conference, and I've been so impressed by the events that I've seen. There really has been a multiplicity of ideas and theories, and soon this hall will empty, and the Zoom rooms will dissolve, and some of us will journey home by bus, by train, by car, by aeroplane. But for now, we're together in the real and the virtual world. So just sit back, relax. We're going to think about some stories. And I am going to show some slides, but you don't have to look at them. You can close your eyes. You can just relax. Think about the pictures in your head. Lines of love and fear connect us to our ancestors. Stories. What's your first memory? What's the first story that you remember? When you remember that story, do you see the same pictures in your head that you think you saw back then? Whose voice do you hear it in? Your own? Or the person that told it to you? Mother, father, grandparent, sibling, teacher. The American writer, Tim O'Brien, See, this is why I'm not a proper academic, because I can't even use the thing.
I guess you need to this. Yes.
So I didn't draw this picture myself. So what did I do wrong? So this is what I see when I sit in my room in Glasgow. This is actually a picture of me. No? It doesn't work. Oops, am I pressing the wrong thing? Ah, there we go. Here we go, I've got it. I'm actually blind. So the American writer Tim O'Brien, In the Lives of the Dead, a short story that draws on his memories of serving in Vietnam, writes, "In a story, which is a kind of dreaming, the dead sometimes smile and sit up and return to the world." Stories can be memories that conjure the dead. What was the first story that made you afraid to go to sleep? What was the first story that made you cry? When did you first see yourself at the center of the story? Did you, without a thought, change gender, ethnicity, or even species to become the hero of the tale? Did you time travel? It's popular to talk about a global world, and we live in an age imagined previously by scientists and writers of science fiction who are sometimes the same people. We press a button on our phone and we see our loved one's face on screen and we have a conversation. Somewhere in the California desert, servers blink and emails fire across the globe. Essential news, warnings, systems planning, alerts about new pandemics, favorite recipes, knitting patterns, a photo of a new baby, job references, letters from princes who can make you into a millionaire if you give them your bank detail. The world has always been global. Stories travel. And this is a picture by Sophie Anderson, whose dates are 1823 to 1903. The Sultan Shahryar had a wife whom he loved more than all the world, and his greatest happiness was to surround her with splendor and to give her the finest dresses and the most beautiful jewels. It was therefore with the deepest shame and sorrow that he accidentally discovered after several years that she had deceived him completely, and her whole conduct turned out to have been so bad that he felt himself obliged to carry out the law of the land and order the Grand Vizier to put her to death. He was sure that all women were as wicked as her, and that the fewer the world contained, the better. So every evening he married a fresh wife and had her strangled the following morning. Every day saw a girl married and a wife dead. One day, when the Grand Vizier was talking to his eldest daughter, Scheherazade, who was his delight and pride, Scheherazade said to him, "Father, I have a favor to ask of you." So we know what happens next. Against her father's wishes, and the Grand Vizier's daughter, Scheherazade, volunteers to be the next bride, the next strangled corpse. And in the way of fairy tales, she has one last wish before she submits to the king. She asks permission to tell her sister a bedtime story. Scheherazade knows how to tell a good story, and each dawn it breaks on a different cliffhanger. And if the king wants to discover the denouement to the tale, he must keep the vizier's daughter alive for one more night. And so it continues for 1001 nights, at the end of which the king falls in love with Scheherazade, and he marries her, and he resolves to keep her alive. This is what passes as a happy ending. The Arabian Nights, the tales of 1001 nights, were collected over centuries from various Asian and Middle Eastern countries, from India, Africa, Syria, Iran, Egypt, Turkey, and elsewhere. And of course, many of these tales were first told orally. The first known manuscript, some pages from Syria, dates from the 9th century, and a version of the collection reached France in 1704. In his introduction to the 2008 Penguin edition of the Arabian Nights, Robert Irwin writes that the collection is a vast storytelling ocean in which the reader can lose themselves. So the collection is pinned by repetition, the kind of repetition that's typical of the oral storytelling tradition. Because how do we remember the stories we tell? Repetition and rhythm, strong storylines, characters whose motives are so clear that we predict their actions even as we marvel of them. And part of the joy, of course, lies in tension and repetition, the anticipation that this creates. And oral stories change, of course, with repetition. They develop curlicues. The teller knows their audience, and they slip in jokes and horrors designed just for them to amuse and excite them. And this can also be true of the printed word. And this, of course, is Beatrix Potter and a modern rendering by Christian Boer. What did Mrs. Mcgregor do to Peter Rabbit's father? We bloodthirsty children shouted whenever my mum read us the tale of Peter Rabbit. She put him in a pie, we would scream. So the fate of poor Peter Rabbit's father thrilled us. And I used to imagine his fluffy tail sticking out from the pastry. 1001 Nights is redolent with magic, and it exists to beguile and to entertain, like the bedtime stories we were told as children, all tucked up tight in bed, and like them too, it has instructive aspects. Transgress and bad things will come to you. Remember what happened to Peter Rabbit's father. Mrs. Mcgregor put him in a pie. Children fear being eaten. So our interpretation of the meanings of stories also alters, as Toma Tasovit noted yesterday, and authorial intentions are hard to identify. Perhaps original listeners considered Scheherazad's presence as embodying ideals of honour and ownership, the place of woman. But of course, for me, a 21st century woman, reading the story hundreds of years after it was first composed, circulated, refined, told and retold, it contains dark expressions of patriarchy. Story 19, early in the sequence, is still not strange enough yet, still something that we can recognise and identify with and imagine. This is a story about the murder and dismemberment of a woman whose husband thinks that she's been unfaithful. So Scheherazad's life, of course, depends on holding the king, and she needs to keep his attention until dawn, and so, of course, she chooses a popular topic, one that she knows he's going to be interested in, the murder of a woman by a husband who thinks that she is unfaithful. Scheherazade has to show the king that a loyal woman exists, but she must never suggest that the killer is reprehensible, not if she wants to keep her clever head on her shoulders. And so popular is the concept of the multiple murders of women that this story exists in many different places, many different traditions. Bluebeard from France, the old dam and her hen from Norway, and the Fitcher's bird from Germany, one of the Grimm stories. Bluebearding is a verb used in modern parlance. It means the multiple murder, or stringing along, seducing and abandoning multiple women. And the beat, oops, I'm going backwards. That's Bluebeard. And the beat goes on. So these are lots of crime thrillers involving serial killers. And as you can see, this covers, this is just a tiny, tiny sample. It covers quite a wide range of subgenres. There's novels here by so-called literary writers, and there's things that you might consider slightly more ephemeral. On average, 3 women are murdered every week in the UK, and your own countries will have their own statistics. So, of course, everything contains its opposite. In the chain of, there was a series of murders in Glasgow in the late 80s and 90s that led to people thinking that a serial killer was actually loose within the city. And there's a chain of 8 murders and close calls in Glasgow, which included at least one beating classified as attempted murder. As I say, this led to speculation that a serial killer was at work. But there wasn't any consolation to be found in this image of murderer as monster. There was no Jack the Ripper creature shrouded in mist and madness. It turned out that the killers were unconnected men, men in the street, men we might know, men we might work beside or be related to. And Denise Mina, the Glasgow author, wrote a book last year called The Less Dead, which was published in 2021, and it's inspired by this series of murders. And Margot, the protagonist at the centre of The Less Dead, also discovers that the killings are not down to a lone wolf with a mental health problem, but the responsibility of several unconnected men. And she asks how many of them did those things and then got married, became fathers, uncles, and co-workers. She realizes that they're everywhere. So crime fiction sometimes resurrects the dead only to kill them over again. And in the wrong hands, this can result in further desecration. But handled well, sometimes it could be a political act. So Scheherazade's framing device adds a sense of veracity. We hear her voice. And for the same reason, Gothic stories are frequently narrated in the first person. They begin with the intimation that this might be a true story. In his short ghost story, The Mirror, Haruki Murakami tells the reader, "This happened more than 10 years ago, and I've never told anyone about it. I was afraid even to talk about it. I felt that if I did, it might happen all over again, and so I've never brought it up." And Murakami is writing in an intimate voice. We might be sitting around the fireside together. The events happened a decade ago, and so the narrator's recollection might be foggy. And yet what happened has stayed with him. Perhaps he sees it clearly yet. Whatever the truth, the event was too frightening to utter until now. And the nervous listener, reader, might worry about what they're going to hear, because fear, after all, is infectious. Might the events in the story themselves translate themselves to us and repeat playing out death like the videotape in The Ring, the classic horror movie? So there's a sense of delay about this introduction, which invites tension. And this is in itself is a well-established trope. We might say that Scheherazad's contribution is an exercise in delay. Some of you will remember the opening of Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's masterpiece, which begins with the letters that are close to a diary, and again, delay, but entice the listener. So the concept, and this is, I put this in because you can see it's a sort of similar, and this is The Nightmare by Henry Fuseli, and it's often used to illustrate Gothic stories, particularly Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Tension and release refers to the build-up of musical intensity that eventually dissolves and relaxes. And I took this quote from a site that's the School of Composition, which is an online site for budding composers of music. So you can see this idea of tension and release exists in other art forms, but the idea of tension and release, delay and gratification exists in ourselves, it exists in our bodies. Notably in the sexual act, the storyteller is honing instincts that we all know. We embody them, we recognize them, even if we can't put a name to them. But let's get back to Murakami. There he is. Murakami tells us, "This took place on a windy night at the beginning of October. Actually, it was rather steamy for the time of year, and the wind was noisy. The gate to the swimming pool was broken, and the wind made the gate snap open and shut. I thought of fixing it, but it was too dark out, so it kept banging all night." So Murakami has set the scene for a classic ghost story, a dark autumn night, but steamy, the air fogged, vision uncertain, the banging gate which snags the nerves and might mask the approach of danger. And some of you might find it a bit corny, and maybe it is, but to you I say, relax. Stories are also fun. So an intimation of veracity adds heightened sense of danger to the stories and we might know are made up. And ally this with tension and release and a sense of atmosphere, and we start to cook up something with potential to hold our audience. Of course, as I've already noted with Denise Mina's The Less Dead, actual crimes and outrages inspire fiction, and in Picturesque Notes, published in 1879, his account of the history of the city of Edinburgh, Robert Louis Stevenson writes, "People hushed their voices over Burke and Hare, over drugs and violated graves, and the resurrection men smothering their victims with their knees." And notice the cadence, the repetition of the rhythm. So Burke and Hare committed 16 murders over a period of about 10 months in 1828 in Edinburgh. And their crimes were winked at by sections of the medical establishment who needed a fresh supply of cadavers for anatomy lessons. And the hypocrisy that underpinned this case helped to inspire Stevenson's short story, The Body Snatchers, one of my favourites, and his novel, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which was published in 1886. And like Scheherazade, Stevenson reveals the centre of his novel through a series of stories written within stories. He employs letters, diaries, first-hand accounts, which enable the reader themselves to effectively take on the role of detective. And fiction seemed to imitate life when 2 years later, a series of murders began in Whitechapel, generally known as the Jack the Ripper murders, and similarities between this and Stevenson's novel led to this chap on the right, Richard Mansfield, being persecuted. He was an actor, apparently a very big-headed actor, so nobody minded, and he was persecuted by people who believed he was actually Jack the Ripper, and the show had to close. So Stevenson is the writer that I return to, perhaps because he's one of the first writers that I discovered and I fell in love with. And I asked you a series of questions at the start of this presentation, and I'm going to answer some of them for myself. The first story I remember being told that came out of a book is Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, the best book ever written. And it's an adventure story involving pirates, buried treasure, lost maps, castaways, skeletons, blind Pew, Long John Silver, and lashings of jeopardy. I was Jim Hawkins, the boy at the centre of the story, stowed away on the pirate ship, and though I knew nothing about the mid-18th century when the novel's set, and I had never climbed the rigging or wielded a cutlass, I inhabited the story to the extent that it kept me awake at night. And the memory of this book is also a memory of my father, of the sitting room of our council flat, where I remember we sat on the floor so we could look at the book's pictures, the map with its compass, the X that marked the spot where the buried treasure was hidden. It is a memory of library visits, of becoming obsessed with books and worrying about what I would do when I'd read every volume on the library shelves. Robert Louis Stevenson was born in Edinburgh, the city I grew up in, and this book is also a memory of my city before I was born, a continuity with the consciousness of my father, whose memory is now failing. And when I walk the streets of Edinburgh, the city I grew up in, I see them as they are now, but I get glimpses of the Edinburgh of my father's childhood and of Stevenson's time, places 100 years apart. Memory, story, and identity are closely woven. Our first memories typically date from around the age of 3, which is when we begin to tell very, very simple stories. And neuroscientists have all sorts of theories about this. They talk about patterns which facilitate the way we interpret the world. But as a writer, I reduce the concept to the statement that stories are how we understand the world. We think of our lives as narratives. We give them form, whereas in reality, as we know, as we've seen, life is punctuated by events, some of which may connect, but many of which are random and beyond our control. So stories, of course, are also repositories of wider cultural truths, of people and events that official histories gloss over or don't think it politic to record. And some literary academics dispute the foundation of contemporary crime fiction. Some say it was Caleb Williams, written by William Godwin in 1794. And others say, oh, it was The Murder in the Rue Morgue by Edgar Allan Poe, 1841. But of course, I don't care. I don't give a monkey's. I think it started off with folktales and legends. But I think it's notable and interesting that these two early texts invite discussions on social inequality and racial injustice. And Caleb Williams, also called Things as They Are, opens with a cry to the heavens that unjustly convicted prisoners from Robben Island to Guantanamo Bay and beyond would recognize. My life has for several years been a theatre of calamity. I have been a mark for the vigilance of tyranny, and I could not escape. So 18-year-old Caleb Williams is from humble beginnings. His mother and father are dead and he's all alone in the world. Nevertheless, he is a very bright boy and he secures a good position as a secretary to the local squire, the lord or the laird, as I would say. Things are going really well, but Caleb has a flaw that is common to crime fiction heroes. His nose bothers him, and he doesn't know when to leave well alone. Caleb discovers that his master has committed a murder, and he confronts him. And what follows is a series of imprisonments, escapes, adventures, and misadventures in which Caleb is ruthlessly stalked and in fear of his life. The squire's respectability is the shield that allows him to behave despicably without suffering any consequences. This is a world in which the poor have no protection from the forces of wealth and state should they decide to conspire against them. This is, as William Godwin's alternative title tells us, things as they are. And the novel Caleb Williams can be considered a companion piece to Godwin's political treatise, Inquiry Concerning Political Justice, and its influence on the morals and happiness. And the novel condenses the essential message against tyranny into a more accessible form. And Godwin used to joke that people read in one night what had taken him a year to write. And it's interesting that at the same time, Mary Wollstonecraft, author of The Rights of Women, is also writing a Gothic novel with the intention of carrying her message forward as well. And sadly, she dies, as we know, giving birth to Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. Edgar Allan Poe's The Murder on the Rue Morgue. This is a really grotesque story, I think, and it introduces the detective Auguste Dupin, who is the logical detective, a precursor of Sherlock Holmes by Arthur Conan Doyle and Hercule Poirot, Agatha Christie's hero. And these detectives, they don't recount the story themselves. Instead, the cases are relayed to the reader by an intimate companion, a witness to the investigation. They're really close at hand, and they're thrilled by the action. And we, in turn, the reader, mirror their amazement. So critics vary on discussions of Edgar Allan Poe's attitudes towards slavery. And this is something that we could have an entire conference on. Maybe we should have an entire conference on. Poe lived, of course, in walking distance to one of the largest slave auctions in the American South, a place where enslaved Africans were bought and sold like chattel. And he would have been intimately connected, familiar with the institution of slavery at a point when it was highly contended. And enslavement is embedded within Murder in the Rue Morgue in a way that invites several possible interpretations. And it begins, like Murakami's story, with the emphasis on nighttime wanderings. And this is a locked room mystery whose solution seems beyond ordinary mortals, but Detective Dupin's vision is clear. The murderer is revealed to be, wait for it, an orangutan brought back to Paris by a sailor who's treated it badly. Poe's intentions with the story are less obvious. Does he sympathize with the creature, or does he find its actions an inevitable consequence of innate brutality? And whatever your conclusions, I don't know what my conclusion is, whatever it is, this story contains a message beyond the mental gymnastics and the bold actions that are described on the page, and it invites uncomfortable conversations for the modern reader, for us, several generations after publication. Wider societal injustice underpins the best Gothic and crime fiction. And in his essay, The Simple Art of Murder, Raymond Chandler writes, "The realist in Murder writes of a world in which gangsters can rule nations and almost rule cities." And this statement might have extra resonance for us coming from the UK. Hard-boiled crime fiction combines poetry, grit, and Gothic sensibilities. The person we have to fear is once again the person at the top. The biggest crime is hypocrisy. But I don't really want to suggest that crime fiction is somehow pure. You know, Raymond Chandler is a diamond in the rough. And this is a genre where women, people of colour, disabled people, the working classes, LGBT plus people are regularly, one might even say, traditionally identified as killers and agents of crime. But once again, it's easy to see how these conventions can be flipped. Everything contains its opposite. And from the very start of the appearance of hard-boiled crime, writers use the genre to reclaim power and express political and social agendas. So this is Rudolf Fischer. He was a doctor and an active participant in the Harlem Renaissance and a supporter of the Pan-African Congress. And The Conjure Man Dies, published in 1932, is the first crime novel that we know of to feature a black detective and an all-black cast of characters. And the novel employs aspects of the logical Dupin, Hercule Poirot, Sherlock Holmesian style detective. Very sadly, Fisher died before he got the chance to write the other two novels he'd intended in the same series. This chap will be recognisable to many of you. Chester Himes also sets his crime fiction in Harlem. And Himes started his career, he's a contemporary of, James Baldwin. He begins his career writing what he considers to be literary novels. But it's only when he starts to write detective fiction, which he does for a quick buck, that he just thought this is a chance to make some money, which he needed very badly. Only then does he reach commercial and critical success, which he reaches initially in France, not in the United States. So Fisher and Himes take the lives and the environment of African Americans as their subject, and both novelists combine the hyper-realism with the absurdity. And as you see, Himes writes, "I thought I was writing realism. It never occurred to me that I was writing absurdity." Realism and absurdity are so similar in the life of American blacks that one cannot tell the difference. Fisher and Himes are both born 20 years apart, but they live, of course, still in the shadow of enslavement, and indeed both of them had close relatives who had been enslaved. They cannot depict the lives of African Americans they're living in Harlem, and in the early 30s in Fisher's case, in a 10-year period, 59 to 69, in the case of Himes, without depicting inequality and a world designed to exclude and limit the prospects of people of colour. So they have found a conduit through crime fiction for what Godwin describes as the world as it is, this low form rather than literary fiction, so-called low form. Both writers, of course, power their texts with humour, which is really close to anger. So the child that I was, lying on the floor, side by side with my father, reading Treasure Island, I didn't know the discomforts of an 18th century pirate ship. And similarly, white readers of Fisher and Himes, however much they appreciate the writer's work, will not truly know what people of colour experienced in Harlem. Readers of colour then and now may feel the added recognition that seeing people you know walking across the page, that added frisson of pleasure, I suppose, and realism. So I've travelled far from Scheherazade, who after all is a fictional character, and yet I feel a line of connection between Scheherazade and Fisher and Himes. Fisher and Himes are both constricted. They're both held hostage by a more powerful society that refuses them freedoms and threatens their lives simply because of the colour of their skin. And their stories are challenges against a system in history which has the potential to crush them. And when we read their books, we hear stories and voices coming from the page, angry, full of humour, lively, sexy, creative, and intelligent. So you'll notice that my account's been historical, and I think this is because this is the other way that I understand the world, through history. And perhaps this is the other reason that I'm attracted to crime fiction. I ask, how did things come to this? Who committed the crime? Why did they do it? The secret that all writers know is that you can only write what you can write. I sit down and I plan out a very intelligent philosophical text, and then wham, suddenly somebody has been murdered. Someone else is doing a striptease. Somebody opens a bottle of whiskey. Somebody takes out a gun. It's maybe not quite as cliched as that, but it's quite close to the truth, actually. As a queer writer who grew up in Scotland in a period when society and sections of the law were openly hostile towards LGBTQ+ people, I wanted to flip the genre the way that Fisher and Himes do and put an openly queer person at the centre of the action. And with my first book, it was very important to me that my hero was untroubled by their sexuality. I wanted them to traverse the city like Chandler's Marlowe, aware of its dark underbelly, but also able to gain entry into the room at the top of society's high towers. And my hero was Rilke. Like Marlowe, he was named after a poet, and like Murakami's narrator, he was frequently troubled by bad weather. Of course, the book was set in Glasgow. And that first novel was called The Cutting Room. It came out in 2002. And I've been thinking a lot about it recently because 8 novels and 20 years later, I revisited it in a sequel called The Second Cut, which, like the previous book, is set at the time of its publication, in this case 2022. And I didn't go back and read that first book. I didn't try to ventriloquize my younger self. Instead, I worked with the memory of the voice I conjured 20 years before, and that memory was of a different time, when people smoked indoors, when the internet was new and equal weddings were undreamt of, when queer people didn't dare hold hands in public, and when a homophobic attack would very probably not be reported to the police for fear that they gave you another beating. And the Scotland that I inhabit now is a very changed place, but it does please me that what was reality in the year 2000 is a memory recorded in a text that I wrote in anger that was expressed in broad humour and Gothic thrills. And the book was translated into over 20 languages, and who knows, maybe it made some contribution, I don't know, towards these changing attitudes towards LGBTQ+ people. I don't know. Stories. So perhaps on your journey home from the conference, ask yourself again, what is the first story that you remember, and whose voice do you hear it in? Stories can be memories to conjure the dead, people we wish were with us, and times that we're glad are gone, but nevertheless must remember, because they're part of ourselves, and we must never ever get complacent and think that they're gone for good. Novels and novelists raise more questions than they ever answer. But I have one more question, one very, very last question. Is the fear that thrilling stories raise in us another connection to the past? Do I feel the same sense of dread and delight that my oldest ancestors felt as they sat gathered around a fire and listened to a story being woven? Repetition and anticipation, the wave of tension waiting to break in a scream or a roar of laughter. Thank you very much.